okay from there? Good. That's all that matters. It's only got me. Okay. But it looks okay. I can block them out or anything or turn.
Nicely go. Well, I don't know. It might have to turn.
Okay. So I'll square it out. I'm still learning video editing at this point in time. It's good practice, if nothing else. Brethren, I will preface this a couple things before I start as well. I realize now, as I was sitting over there, this feels very much like 10 years ago that I am doing a presentation under your direction. It seems that I cannot seem to escape any of your requests to be able to do long-winded educations at talks. I don't believe it is, but I was contemplating that as I was sitting there. It just seems that there's a little bit more of a experience behind it these days than there was at that point in time. Brethren, this talk ties into what Right Worshipful Brother Burge was talking about the last meeting that I was at in the summer. We had a very stimulating talk on morality and ethics at that time. It was topical, and the end goal of the talk was to spur thoughtfulness into whether there was a set of ethics that defined our jurisdiction, or even broader, into our fraternity. In the end, and I apologize if this was not the intent of your talk, but this is what I personally took away from that discussion. Just the cliff notes. First, morals and ethics define what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. But these two sets of rules are separated by the source of what defines them. Morals are defined by the self and emerge from the internal. Ethics are defined by the group, defined by the external. But the question that we were asked at the end of it, who actually defines these things within our fraternity? Who can judge someone on their morals? And that becomes very abstract in its definition. And how do we set boundaries around that definition of what morals are? And in the end, morals are really a variable, depending on who you look at and who you talk to. Sound about right, or? Perfect. For me, when I thought of it and I brought it back and I started this discussion now being about a month later, two passages from the first degree came to mind that helped me define what and how the boundaries on morals and ethics are assumed by the teachings in Freemasonry. First off, on the lessons of the furnishing of the lodge, we learn of the emblems that signify the good and bad in human life, surrounded by the various comforts and blessings that we enjoy throughout this life. For each of us, we experience events. And through both our privileges earned or given and our personal experiences that surround that event, we paint it either black or white, good or bad, such that for each individual, the tiles or the events may be a different color individually, for they may perceive or experience that same event differently. Secondly, on prudence, we learn to regulate our lives and our actions agreeably to the dictates of reason. Essentially, as modern Freemasonry emerged in the Age of Enlightenment, where reason was the primary philosophical theme of that period, we are taught that our personal perceptions of the internal and external actions of our worlds need to be judged with reasonable criticism instead of blind faith. In combining these two teachings, one could derive that the state that morality and ethics are constructs of situations in our lives. These constructs are regulated through rational contemplation and logical thinking, and categorized into good and bad behaviors by that individual. Through questioning our reality and our interaction with it, and the individualized events each person experiences, we define what our moral standing is. And while morals, through this, may vary by individual, the defining boundaries of everyone is standardized and formal. But that still leaves it very abstract at its core. What exactly constitutes a of rational mind and who is reasonable? Well, go to Webster's. Easiest thing to Google up first off. Webster states that rationality is having reason or understanding relating to, based on, or agreeable to reason. Seems redundant, but where reason is a sufficient ground of explanation or a logical defense, especially something such as a principle or a law that supports a conclusion or explains a fact. That is to say that a rational person would act according to laws, principles, and virtues that are accepted amongst his society, which sounds a lot like ethics and how I originally defined it. If we take that argument, it becomes a circular problem. People act rational because of society's codes of ethics. Those ethics are contained within a group of individual morals. Morals are created through rational thought. But that doesn't help define how we understand it, because you get back to the same place you started at. There is, however, another understanding of rational behavior that exists from my background that I enjoy to actually discuss when we talk about philosophical and different aspects that can be applied to Freemasonry, and that's through economics. I've taught economics for 10, 15 years, on and off. I continue to work in that field, and I enjoy being able to apply it to our Masonic philosophies. In economics, we talk about rational behavior as a decision-making process that is based on making choices as the result of the optimal level of benefit, or what is defined in economics as utility, to an individual. Utility is the measure of benefit that economists use to basically measure everything. It creates a standard unit in order to rank choices. If I go to Tim Hortons and I have the choice between a chocolate donut and an apple fritter, one of them is going to give me much more pleasure in eating than the other, and I'm going to rank them accordingly. And so if I spend $2 on one of them, there's going to be an associated benefit of each of them. One of them may be a 5 out of 10, and one of them may be a 7 out of 10. But I have put a quantitative ranking to every single one of them that makes it universal in the ability to measure everybody's happiness. From this, rational behavior is formed and internalized. Personally, I choose to work out instead of eating chocolate, not the other way around. I find the benefit of my time and my money to go towards trying to be more fit. Other people may find that value too much of a burden versus the great taste of chocolate. And so they will choose to eat chocolate and maybe not lose weight as much. But each individual has that choice. Each individual ranks their utility and their benefits based on their internal experiences through life. I played sports. I still play sports. I need to be in good shape to do that. Eating chocolate is bad. Somebody who didn't play sports and sat around all day may not think the same way. Those choices of my tile set has formed what's good and bad. In other words, rational behavior conflicts with that problem of defining reason by being driven by society, or by self that is found in the former definitions. It purely becomes a definition of the micro, the individual, driving the macro, the external and the society. It creates a sequentialism of sorts, which drives us to avoid that chicken and egg problem and circular aspects of one forming from the other, informing, continuing around. My disclaimer is it's not necessarily an absolute truth, but rather my individual perceptions and how I've perceived the world and how I explain it. There has been a lot of discussion in the last month about this paper with people who do not agree with me, and I love it because I have had a different set of experiences than them. They don't agree on the rest of what I'm about to present. Rational behavior faces the formation of all decision-making in economic theory. So much so that it explains in how in a world where everyone knows everything, there's going to be a perfect and optimal solution for every situation based in our world. Every situation has one perfect choice. And if everybody knows everything, that choice is always going to be the one picked. In that situation, nirvana is achieved. We are in enlightenment, and we can transcend. However, being imperfect vessels, that's not true. Individuals make choices on the basis of what they know is optimal, or whatever maximizes that benefit of happiness or utility for themselves. Whatever makes them the most happy, the healthiest, the strongest, the richest, and so on. No individual would ever make a choice that ever makes them worse off from this. If they understand all the costs and payoffs and are rational, meaning that they won't harm themselves, there's no reason to choose anything else. However, because no one has that perfect information, choices can vary due to misinformation from individual experiences. Thus, they make a choice assuming it is the best choice, not understanding the entirety of the situation. This is much of the basis for individualism between humans in an economic theory, which becomes a little bit important later. But because the individual only makes a choice in regard to how much benefit it creates for them, economists have tended to label them as selfish or self-interested. To dig back into Webster's, it states that selfishness, in a general definition, is a concern for one's own welfare or advantage at the expense or disregard of others, or an excessive interest in oneself. That sounds pretty negative. And a lot of the social connotations along with calling someone selfish is different than the economic definition of what selfish is. The negative emotion attached with the word mainly is evoked due to Western Christian traditions, which see selfishness as a central vice, as standing at the roots of the 7 deadly sins in the form of pride. Pride is identified as dangerously corrupt selfishness, putting one's own desires, urges, wants, and whims before the welfares of others. Dante's definition of pride was love of self perverted to hatred and contempt for one's neighbor. Pride can be considered the opposite of prudence, as the ability to regulate your actions become irrational to a prideful man. Selfishness thus runs contrary to the Christian and Masonic teachings, which contain the 7 heavenly virtues, 4 cardinal and 3 theological: temperance, fortitude, prudence, justice, faith, hope, and charity. However, classical economics started with a different theory of what selfish behavior was. Adam Smith, which hopefully is a common name instead of one that would be mostly known by me, is widely renowned as the founder of classical economic theory. And in his book, The Wealth of Nations, which is credited for basically spawning the entire school of thought, actually began the concepts found therein of an earlier work called, which is convenient for this paper, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In it, Smith argues that man was incapable of forming moral judgments beyond the very small network upon which they were centered, and lacked all the information needed to make purely rational, informed decisions. To quote it, he says, "The administration of a great system of the universe, the care and the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weaknesses of his own powers, families, his friends, the weakness of his powers, and to the narrowness of his comprehension, the care of his own happiness, of that is his family, his friends, and his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by the original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, and the dread of pain prompt us to apply those means to our own stakes. And without any consideration to their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. Sounds a little bit familiar. The rich only select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor. And in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only for their own conveniency, though the soul in which they purpose the labors of all the thousands of whom they employ be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand, which was the famous part of his books, to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. And thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. Smith, through his two works, promoted classical liberalism, an ideology that trumps notions of individualism and negative liberty. These core themes inevitably relate to the concepts of selfishness and the choices made by humans as self-serving or beneficial only. Economics in this mindset has grown since Smith. It still clings to this maximizing utility theory as its core. Anything that does not directly benefit an individual must be viewed by that individual as still bettering his life. But through these choices, our society advances itself. From that, Thomas Malthus built his concept of societal advance. He postulated that as a society advances, the general well-being of all increase. And as it increases, it is inevitable that the population will reach a point where points of misery, such as famine, war, and plague, would impair or slow it down. It's mainly applied at that time to agricultural issues. Population could not grow faster than the food that it could produce. But the problem was, mathematically, is that population expands exponentially, food linearly. So food would never grow as fast as population. Population would outpace it. You would have too many people, too many hungry mouths to feed. Something would happen to drive down the population. It was therefore necessary for individuals to not only be advantaged to others, but also for society to see them as such. Malthusian theory was an inspiration for Darwinism and social Darwinism, about how organisms and networks evolve. As a society was to grow, it forces survival of the fittest. Selfishness is laid bare in this situation. Thus, having more for yourself in a thriving society, even where everybody has everything that they ever need, was necessary. Maximizing this utility was not only rational from this train of thought, also very extremely important for individual survival. The core theory of Malthus then became flawed, though. Technological advances proved that agriculture can keep up with the pace of population. But the survival of the fittest, the ideas of greed is good, continue to have credence. But as we all know, society and individuals make seemingly altruistic choices that are contrary to this train of thought. Huxley, in the 1960s, built off of the social Darwinism to explain that altruistic behavior was simply one organism or a genetic train of individuals, ensuring that the survival of those others in that group survived. While it fit, it's lazy. It doesn't explain it, and it doesn't completely complete the picture. Enter in Richard Dawkins, who introduced a train of reasoning to address this, known as the selfish gene theory. His core idea was selfishness wasn't an individual level, but a genetic one. And that genes are essentially immortal. Our individuals are vessels for our genes to continue propagating and existing. Any choice that an individual makes is for the benefit of the gene and not the person. From this, groups can only survive if individuals act in a self-interested manner. If they form alliances, act in ways that ensure their genes have opportunities to become hardier and replicate, individuals will compete for the role of that vehicle that continues the genetic progress, but in the end will sometimes recognize that they are not that vehicle that propagates the gene further and makes selfish genetic choices that seem against the interest of that organism's individual. For humanity, it means that societies are interconnected and share a genetic consciousness that causes individuals and group self-interests to butt heads, where aiding others is sometimes the best choice that derives that maximum utility or benefit and happiness. If we apply this to Freemasonry, when we teach charity, it falls under this mindset and is therefore selfish. So is good work for the craft. Both are referenced as selfish behavior multiple times in Masonic ritual. Think of the three principal rungs of Jacob's ladder. Why is charity the greatest? On the three principal steps, why do entered apprentices and fellow crafts work hard? In the symbol of the Book of Constitutions, guarded by the Tyler's sword, why do we keep mindful of our own thoughts, words, and actions? Each of these examples are of a man who betters himself in the craft. But they also offer examples where the choices are made while benefiting others, is primarily an internal decision of their own self-interest. That while we live these lives, our actions that drive society forward and continue the advancement of our genetic informations will be the best choices that we can make. However, because the shared consciousness of this group is loose at best, it's not perfect, it's not a complete information, individuals experience different sets of their information that tile their floor. How to best achieve that common goal isn't always the same. Contemplate many of the characters' actions in the third degree, and also how they can be defined as selfish. Think about why the fellow crafts reflected and recanted on their actions. Why the absentees decided that they were going to continue. And why Hiram chose to not divulge those secrets in his responses. Each of these actions represent choices by those individuals that maximize their benefit or utility based on what they believe is best. It also teaches sympathy and understanding that while you may not agree with an individual choice, you can understand where they're coming from. And in that thread, it also gives a chance to highlight what is considered ethical behavior. The fellow crafts, while heinous in their original thoughts, were forgiven due to aligning to the group's ethical good in the end. The absentees were reprimanded and punished for something that set back the greater society for personal gain. And Hiram was praised for his sacrifice to further the group's benefit. And in doing so, from defining all of this, we get back to what is ethical and what is moral. We now have a group of individuals making choices that are good and bad, but always for their best decisions. But us as a group have voted or chosen or aligned on one single choice that's better than the other. and we enact on the rest of the group that decision of what's morally good and bad, even though individual morals may be different. In conclusion, the point taken from the observance of this social science mindset is that rational thinking creates an individual set of morals based on each individual's maximizing their utility, whether it be for pure capitalistic utility, social Darwinism, or even our genes that make the decisions for us. Morals drive us to do what we see as best for our continued existence. Or in much simpler terms, by being selfish, that person sets the boundaries to their morality. However, it is groups of people in civil societies that determine what's wrong and right for the group as a whole in order to advance that group or society. And to help guide those that have corrupted morals when their individual experiences create choices too far from the path normal to the group. If we return back to Smith and his moral sentiments, he states, this disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful and to despise or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, though necessary both to establish and to maintain the distinction of ranks among the order of society, is at the same time the great and most universal cause of corruption in our moral sentiments. That wealth and greatness are often regarded with the respect and admiration which are due only to wisdom and virtue, and that the contempt of which vice and folly are the only proper objects is often most unjustly bestowed upon poverty and weakness, has been the complaint of moralists in all ages. This ties in strongly with the moral teachings of the external and the external wealth of the first degree, and further highlights those trappings of the Malthusian theory. Admiring those with great stature that will survive any population miseries that may arise is to see the ultimate goal of avoiding personal demise, but potentially at the cost of missing the greater societal good that will not only benefit everyone else, but ultimately is the best, most selfish decision for that individual. Such viewpoints are seen as morally corrupt, and thus it becomes every individual with good standings prerogative to right the ship and course correct those views. In this end, as a solution to the corruption of moral sentiment, Freemasonry is an avenue to help men understand their moral compasses through the ethics that it teaches, and to better sympathize with others, much like the example above of the internal and external wealth. Through our ritual, we are taught to be selfish. By temperance, to better avoid the allurements of vices which misinform you of their benefits, you are better able to define your own set of morals. You are able to understand what motivates and defines others, to form a view to better help yourself by helping others. Your choices may still be selfish, but you have more perfect information to the collective consciousness and the general good in order to make the right decision. By fortitude, cowardice and brashness are defined as morally corrupt and no help to anyone else but that individual. In teaching the benefit of fortitude to the unaware, it helps right their moral bearings and properly value them versus the alternatives that are seen as corrupt. By justice, one cannot simply convince someone to change their morals through debate, for it is purely an individual experience. But they can change what they value and by how much. Changing the cost or the payout is something that most economics think of. You want more participants to write papers in your lodge? Up the reward. You want to deter certain behaviors? Up the penalty. By giving every man his just due, we elevate the individual moral to the social ethical virtues. By doing all this, we help men be more prudent. By being more prudent, they are more rational. By being more rational, they become more selfish, but hopefully in a good way. And by being more selfish, they further themselves as well as the craft. To all of this, I would say, my brothers, that choosing that which benefits you the most and being selfish is the only way our society moves forward. But in order to ensure that we are all moving in that same direction, we need to continue to learn and continue to educate each other, not for our benefit, but the entirety of our society. Thank you, brother.